Well, I certainly hope you enjoyed that last segment with Todd Jagger and his discussion of Wolfpack. And I'm going to shift gears a little bit on you here. We're going to start looking at demographics. I never know where an idea from the show is going to come from. And a few weeks ago, I was at a lecture at the Ideas Fest, the Aspen Institute Ideas Fest. And I don't know what made me attend this particular lecture, but it was on demographics. And it brought a new concept to me, at least in my thinking about the political system, and introducing the notion of the millennials, the generation that is now starting to vote, or has been voting for the last 10 years or so, and the impact of the millennials on the system. And you'll notice in the last segment, although Todd is not a millennial, many of the members of his group that he's working with are millennials. And the television show out of New York that is fostering some of this effort is also focused on millennials. And similarly, I think in the past show that we did on Represent Us, all about millennials. So from this particular lecture that I attended and some of these issues that we're now looking into, I'm very intrigued by millennials, and I'm also very encouraged to find that this younger generation is stepping up and becoming a very politically active generation. So the lecture that I attended was a speech by Paul Taylor. And Paul Taylor is with the Pew Research Center, and he's written a book called The Next America. So in Paul's book, he spends a lot of time talking about boomers, a generation I'm part of, and millennials, and not necessarily the tensions between the two, but just clearly pointing out the interests of the two groups, where they're at now, where they may be headed, and how this helps shape the political system. So after listening to Paul's lecture and starting to do a little more research and getting caught up on this whole notion of millennials, I found a group, the Reason Group. I hope it's Reason Group is correct. I don't know the correct spelling. I don't know them or their work as well. I've heard of Pew Research Center before. And they've done a survey called Millennials, the Politically Unclaimed Generation. The politically unclaimed generation. And I don't think that's inconsistent with Mr. Taylor's findings from his book. This generation seems to be politically up for grabs in a lot of respects, and maybe that's driving some of the polarization. I don't know, that the Democrats and Republicans are going to start fighting vehemently for the attentions of this particular generational group. And when you look at some of the statistics, things that I found very surprising, I want to talk a little bit about today, and then on future shows, I want to keep expanding this notion of looking at demographics and trying to understand how demographics can be driving politics, and then maybe how those demographics can be driving dysfunction and polarization. So we're going to take some of the facts from the Reason Group study, but I think most of these facts are similarly consistent with Mr. Taylor's findings. So first of all, it suggested that 34% of this group is independent. I don't know if 34% is necessarily or statistically a large independent component, but the suggestion, I think, of both studies is that most of this group, or a significant portion of this group, has not locked in yet on any one particular party that they will be supporting, let's say, for their entire voting lives. So there's a large independence to this group. Probably more interesting is the makeup of this group and their politics. We have social liberals, fiscal conservatives. No, I don't know what that sounds like to you, but it sounds to me like social liberals, Democrat, fiscal conservatives, Republican. So when you have a large group, you have a generation that has this balance, you could see where perhaps they might be up for grabs politically. Maybe in an environment where social issues are going to be dominant, they will be leaning towards Democrats, or maybe in an environment where fiscal issues are going to be dominant, they could be leaning towards Republicans. In fact, an article I read recently on this group suggests that as they age and as they start getting more involved and concerned with fiscal matters, that would tend to drive them to the Republican Party. At the present time, however, this group is voting Democratic. They have been supporting President Obama at a minimum. I don't know how that's translating to the congressional races, but again, they are currently voting Democratic. Now, in terms of this research that suggests that they may start to move Republican, and once again, I think consistent with the research from both groups, is the notion that this generation is going to be under great redistributive pressures. Great redistributive pressures. In other words, their future role in Social Security, in health care, in pensions, is all going to be disproportionate to some of the past generations' roles. The long and short of some of these initiatives at the government level is that to a certain extent they're like Ponzi schemes. You need a strong generational base at the bottom to support the generation at the top that's drawing down most of the benefits. Well, what's happening in the United States right now, and similar to most industrialized countries, is we're not having a pyramid shape anymore. We're kind of like a semi-pyramid shape, or even some countries are starting to have a reverse pyramid shape, like Japan. Well, when you start having that shape, you distort the underlying principles of how some of these systems have been put in place. Again, Social Security and Medicare, at a very 10,000-foot level, they're dependent upon larger, younger generations supporting smaller, older generations. Well, that's shifting in America right now. And you also see this playing out somewhat in Obamacare. In order for Obamacare to work, this generation, which normally might not get health insurance, it's a very healthy cohort. Again, we're talking about age 18 to age 29. That's a very healthy cohort. So when you have a very healthy cohort, they may not go out and get insurance, yet Obamacare is forcing them to get insurance, or in lieu thereof, to pay some type of a tax penalty for not having purchased the insurance. So you can see these fiscal pressures are going to be mounting on this generation. And again, the suggestion being that as the fiscal pressures mount, then perhaps they will start leaning toward their fiscal conservative bent as voters and not as much to their social liberal bent as voters. So we're going to start looking more at millennials. We're going to start looking more at demographics. And I suggest that perhaps you want to start finding ways to catch up on this interesting dynamic yourself. I have found many, many articles now that are supportive of these data sets, and many articles that are putting forth some very interesting ideas, not only on what millennials are and what they represent, but what it means to the future of our political system.